Dave Talks Comics, Episode 125, Small Press Expo 2016, Part 2.
I don't want the world to know. I don't want my heart to show. Two faces have
Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, the program where I talk about comic books, cartoons, and comic book conventions. Most episodes are a mix of summary and opinion and include spoilers. All past episodes can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. In addition to the program's website, this podcast can also be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and Facebook. On this episode, I will be talking about the first day of the 2016 Small Press Expo, or SPX, in North Bethesda, Maryland, including what I bought, the panels I went to, and what I had to eat. Today, the second day of the Small Press Expo 2016, was a little shorter, I think on the whole, and definitely a little shorter for me than the first day was. I started it in a similar way to the first day, in that I went to the store, to Whole Foods, and got some food for some lunch food, some curry chicken salad and potato salad and a root beer and some cookies and pita bread. Actually, the pita bread I had at home. I still had some at home from the other day. And I packed that up and I took that with me to the show because it worked out so well yesterday. So why not do it again? And anyway, I meant to leave early. The show didn't open until noon today, but I was up late last night recording about the first day and putting stuff together and taking care of stuff that had nothing to do with the show, like laundry and things like that. So I didn't get to bed until I think a little after midnight, and that's late for me. So I meant to leave earlier, but I didn't, and the reason why I didn't, or a big part of it, is because I decided to take a nap after I'd had breakfast, and I slept for over an hour, and I woke up and it was 11:30. The show started at noon, and it was about a 25-minute drive between the drive and I think the time it took me to walk there. Well, the drive certainly was about 20 to 25 minutes to get there, and that was with decent traffic. In other words, not too much traffic. So I got to the show today around 12:30. I walked around a little bit. Actually, I didn't walk around that much before. I headed straight for the Fantagraphics table, and I bought Heartbreak Soup. I checked once more to see if they had The Girl from Hoppers, the second collection of Jaime Hernandez work on Love and Rockets. They didn't. That was the same as yesterday. So I picked up Heartbreak Soup, and I think I got the last copy that they had in stock there at the show. I had a bit of trouble paying for it because the guy who I wanted to give money to was talking to somebody else, and I didn't want to interrupt, and so I finally ended up walking around. They had a fairly big table, so I ended up walking around to another part of the table and eventually gave somebody else the money. And then the Hernandez brothers were signing at that point, I think until 1 o'clock, and I didn't look at the line before I went and bought Heartbreak Soup. I just assumed it was going to be pretty long. But after I bought it, I decided, well, why don't I just take a look and see how long the line is? I figured it'd be, 30 or 40 people deep. But when I looked, it was only about 10 people deep, maybe not even quite that much, but probably no more than about 10 people. So I decided, what the hell, let me get in line and wait and see if I can get Beto to sign this book for me. And so that's exactly what I did, and it only took me maybe 10, maybe 15 minutes to get to the front of the line. And that worked out quite well, although I didn't really have much of an exchange with him. When I got to the front, I just said, could you sign this for me? And he just took it and didn't really say anything. He signed it, he handed it back to me, and I said, thank you, and he didn't really say anything, and that was about it. I wasn't sure what else to say, and I've never been good at talking to creators. It's one of those things that's a little strange. Sometimes if you're a little too direct, it doesn't work out that well. It's like you almost need to have something to break the ice. And being the sort of person that I am, and just where my focus is when I'm at a show like this, I don't usually have that handy. There's nothing. It's usually a lot easier to talk to somebody whose work I'm not interested in than somebody whose work I am interested in, for whatever reason. So after I got it signed, and he signed the cover of the book, which I thought was kind of neat, I rushed downstairs because I had about 5 minutes until the first panel that I wanted to go to today began, and that was the spotlight on Charles Burns and Daniel Clowes. And I think I was more interested in it for Daniel Clowes because I've actually read something that he wrote, whereas I haven't read anything that Charles Burns has written. But I'm certainly familiar with the name. I haven't. No, I haven't read anything that Charles Burns has written. So I went to that panel, and that ran from 1 to 2. And then at 2, they cleared the room like they've been doing this year. I'm not sure if this is the first year they've been doing that. It may be. But they cleared the room, so we had to leave. And even though I got there late, I managed to get the seat up front, although it wasn't in the middle up front. It was off on the edge. And it was pretty well attended, I think, this panel. So they cleared the room, and I wanted to go to the next panel that was also in this room. So I left the room, and then I got in line, and it wasn't a very long line, for the spotlight on Trina Robbins. And that went pretty well. And I think I'll talk about these panels after I'm done talking about the day as a whole. And that went fairly well. And so I got out of that around 3 o'clock. Now, originally I had thought about going to the next panel in that room. That would have been 3 panels in a row, and that was the music and comics panel, which featured the 2 big people on it. Well, there's only 3 people in the panel, and those were Jaime Hernandez and Ed Piskor, and I believe John Kelly, who moderated the Fantagraphics at 40 panel, or 40 years of Fantagraphics panel from yesterday, moderated this panel. But I don't know, I felt like I was stalking the Hernandez brothers, and for whatever reason, I was just worried that they would see me and think that I was stalking them or something. I've gotten this feeling before, and I may have mentioned this before, with the Simonsons at Baltimore Comic Con, because I quite often like the panels that they're on, and so I decided not to go to this panel. I have been to panels, at this show that Jaime Hernandez was on, and I went to a panel, was it last year, or I think it was 2 years ago, that Ed Piskor did a panel at Appleseed Comic-Con that I went to. Unfortunately, I didn't tape that. It was a fascinating panel, though, and I did talk about it on the episode whose number I can't remember, but maybe I'll make a note and I'll look it up and figure out which. But it was the 2014 Appleseed Comic-Con episodes. One of those, I believe there was 2, maybe even 3 episodes that I did on that. So I decided to pass on the music and comics panel, and instead I went and found a place to sit, really stand, because I had these, standing tables, which are basically at a height where you can stand. And so I stood there, and I took out my lunch, and I ate my lunch. And after that, I went and found a place to sit down, a couch, and I sat down, and I typed up some notes about what I'd been up to and what I did, and the panels that I had been to. I also finished reading I guess I didn't mention that. I meant to mention that. When I was waiting in line to get Beto to sign my copy of Heartbreak Soup, I started to read the first story in there, and so I continued to... I didn't finish it while I was standing in line. I mean, there was other people, including somebody who was standing a few people behind me, who was talking kind of loudly, which was a bit distracting. I was still able to read, but not quite as quickly as I otherwise might. So the first story is called Cello's Burden. And so I finished reading that. It was only about 10 pages or something like that. Mostly captioned pictures, I think is the best way to describe it. I don't think there was any word balloons. Maybe there was, but I don't think there was any word balloons. So I finished reading that after I ate and after I made my notes. And then I made some notes about that because I like to do that. And that took me up to about 4 o'clock. So at that point, I went back upstairs to the showroom floor. I walked around some more, but I didn't buy anything else. There was one person who I'd noticed whose prints I liked, and I wanted to get one, but I decided to wait until today. And today, I couldn't find the person. And I think I found the table, but the table was empty. I mean, like everything was cleared off the table. It was completely empty. So I guess I blew that one. And so then I walked over. I kind of wound my way through the convention floor and eventually wound up at Dustin Harbin's table. And he had a couple prints that I really liked. And I was looking through his prints. I was looking through he had a book of original art that was also for sale. So I looked through that. He was talking to some people. And then about the time I was ready, he wasn't really available, and I didn't feel like just standing there. And right next to him was Travis Horseman's table. And Travis Horseman is the guy he's the writer of Amiculus, which is this book about the fall of Rome, which happened about 1,500 years ago, about 1,600 years ago. I think the year 475 is when it happened. Although part of the story takes place about 75 years later, because it's about somebody going to investigate exactly what happened from a different part, from the Eastern, I think it was the Byzantine Empire, something like that, who goes to investigate to find out what happened to Rome. So the story takes place in two time periods. So because Dustin Harbin was busy, I stepped over and I talked to Travis for a little while. And I had some things in my head. I recently read the second volume of Amiculus. The third volume is in the works. There's a Kickstarter right now for it, so if you're interested, you might want to Google Amiculus Kickstarter. And they do have one of the levels of support is for a collection that includes all 3 volumes of Amiculus in one book, which is what I think I'm going to get because I seem to have misplaced my copy of the first volume. So I talked to him. There was a couple suggestions I had for him and questions I had for him about the way the story works, about things, because there were some things I was a little unclear on. And this is even with me going back and rereading it and looking through the story, reading it more than once. So we talked for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then I went to buy this print from Dustin Harbin, and he was nowhere to be found. I mean, he hadn't cleared out his table. All his stuff was still there, but he wasn't there. So I decided to leave. There wasn't any more panels that I really wanted to go to. I think there was only 1 or 2 more panels at that point. I think the last panel started at 4:30, which is about what time it was then. So I walked back to my car. I got in the car. I drove home. I listened to part of an episode of WTF, the one with Billy Crystal in it. I've since listened to the rest of that episode, but I only managed to listen to about 20 or 25 minutes of it on the drive home. Excellent episode, though, on the whole, especially if you like Billy Crystal. And I do. I like his comedy. I like his acting. I don't think everything he's done is brilliant, but... So that was basically the end of my day at SPX. And I think what I'm going to go into next is I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2 panels that I went to today. I did tape both of them, and I think I was in a good position to tape both of them. And they were also, the sound quality, the acoustics in the room, and the way the sound equipment was set up was very good, much better than, say, at Baltimore, where I ended up having to do some minor surgery on the recording files in order to make them a little easier on the ear. So I haven't listened to what I've recorded yet, but I'm hopeful that they will come out good. So the first panel that I went to was the spotlight on Charles Burns and Daniel Clowes. This was moderated by Eric Reynolds, who was also on the 40 Years of Fantagraphics panel from the day before. He is I think, an assistant editor, or he's somebody in the back office. He's not a creator himself, but let's see, what does it say here? It says he is a associate publisher, Eric Reynolds. Yeah, that's what it says in the program guide. So he interviewed them, and the good part of this interview was him asking them questions and them responding and bringing things up and discussing them. So it was a lot of Q&A. So here are some of the questions that he asked them. When did you first... first he talked a little bit about meeting them for the first time, because I think he's about my age, actually. I think he's in his mid-40s. And so he started working at Fantagraphics in, I believe, the early 90s. Both of them had been with Fantagraphics for a little while, at least, at that point. So he talked a little bit about meeting them for the first time. He asked them about when they became aware of each other's work, about their memories of the first comic book that they created, not professionally, but the first comic book they created. And Daniel Clowes didn't really want to answer the question. His answer basically was, I'd rather forget about that. But Charles Burns did have a couple brief stories about some of the early comic books that he created, presumably self-published, I believe. Eric asked them about when they first started interacting with other cartoonists or other people who were interested in comics. And this led to some interesting discussions about, Daniel Clowes made an interesting comment about how he loves crazy, obsessive people and that they're like gold. And Charles Burns was asked about whether he knew Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons. Well, that's the most popular thing that he's created. And it also led to some talk about how they would meet other established creators when they were first getting started, and how they would just look people up in the phone book, and sometimes they would call ahead and sometimes they wouldn't, and they would actually go and knock on people's doors to try to meet them. And so they told some stories about meeting people like Mort Drucker and Steve Ditko and Art Spiegelman, and some of those stories turned out better than others. And maybe if you know something about these creators, then maybe you can guess which ones didn't turn out so well. Moving on from that, Eric asked them about how technology and the change in technology has affected their approach to their work and their understanding of it. And that led to an interesting talk about the coloring system that was used at Fantagraphics in the early days, and how it would lead to wildly different results from what you expected, or that the system was it was very hard to predict exactly what you were going to get based on the inputs that you put in, just because of the way the system was designed. And if you want more about that, listen. The recording will come out at some point in the future, and you can hear what I'm talking about. You can, in their words, because it's not a system that I'm familiar with, because of course I don't have any training as in comic books as a comic book artist or a comic book production person of any stripe. Moving on from the discussion of the technology, Eric Reynolds asked them about the way the stories are packaged these days, and that they used to be more serialized, where they would do 3 or 4 issues a year, and now it might be they only do 1 or 2 books every 3 or 4 years. And how has that affected how has that affected? Well, certainly the feedback loop. Because you're not getting feedback as frequently, but also how has it affected the way they produce things, the way they produce things. I think I'm blanking a little bit on exactly what I want to say here. But the next thing that he asked them about was their childhood memories, and how a lot of their works deal in their childhood memories and their adolescence. And he wanted to know if it was as easy as it once was for them to to mine, to get stuff from their past that they can put into the works that they produce, into the comic books, the graphic novels that they produce. And this led into a discussion of parenting, because both of them are parents or fathers. And he asked them, about how their discussion, I don't know if he asked them all these things, but the discussion kind of got into how their kids relate to their work, things like that. He asked them about how they would like, and this was a very broad question, and that became apparent from the answer that he got. How would you like to see the conversation of comics change? Which, of course, I think Daniel Clowes kind of flipped that around on him and, pointed out that, comics are nowhere, they're so vast today. There is so much being produced today that it's nothing like it was 40 years ago, for instance, back in the 1970s, when on a single page you could probably list all the comic books that were coming out. It's a very different world. Because of that, there's so much diversity in terms of the types of books and the types of subjects that are being covered. Not to mention, the way these books are produced. That to say that there's a conversation about comic books is really to ignore the size of the comic book world today. And I'm part of that is me. That's not what, but I think it was implied by, or I'm reading it into, at the very least, what Daniel Clowes said in reaction to that question. He did tell an interesting story when prompted by Eric. He did tell an interesting story about the Ignatz Award that he won. I think it was 10 years ago or something like that. I can't remember. But once again, the story is in the recording. And that was about the end of Eric's questions for them. Then the audience got to ask some questions. There was a question about Liquid Television, which was a show that used to be on MTV back in the early 90s, I guess about 25 years ago. I remember watching it a little bit. Apparently, one of the features on Liquid Television, because there was a lot of animated, I think it might have been all animated features, but one of the features was based on a work of Charles Burns, and his reaction to that was that the people who created the animation, who created the cartoon, changed it so much that he couldn't recognize his own work in there, or there wasn't enough of it to satisfy him, and so he really doesn't like to look at it. Questions from the audience at that point turned to, do you think you work slowly? Do you look back at your works differently? And I think the big takeaway from this was, and this is something that I agree with, and not just in artistic works, but I think in all kinds of work, that slowness is part of the process, and I'm not sure if that's something that either Daniel Clowes or Charles Burns said, or if it's my interpretation. But that slowness is part of the process. In other words, some things take time to evolve, and if you just slap them down, they're not going to be the same as if you take the time, because things need to gestate, is one way to put it. A lot of things need to gestate. Some things need a shorter period to develop. Some things need a longer period to develop. Just like some people develop faster, some people are late bloomers. There was a question from the audience about what makes you gravitate, what attracts you to a particular comic book. What are the ones that they didn't ask what they were enjoying, or maybe they did and I just didn't hear that. But what this person did ask was, what do you look for, and what is it that you want to, that makes you want to read something, makes you want to consume a comic book? And the last couple questions were, there was a question about what it was like being part of the new generation of comic book creators, new at the time, back in the late 70s through the 80s, and And then there was a question about the ethical appropriation of others' works. And those, once again, may be my interpretation of what was said. But the question basically was about, people swiping things. And it wasn't really clear exactly what the person who was asking the question was asking. And it even confused the moderator and the two panelists a little bit. But the question really was, because nothing is really original. I mean, that's something that I feel. Nothing is truly original. There are combinations which are unusual and which work that are unusual, and some that don't work which are unusual. But there really is nothing original anymore, no matter how you think. Sometimes you just haven't thought about it enough. You haven't considered it enough to see the true roots of something that you're doing. But almost always, there is something. It may be coming from left field. It may be coming from a completely different area. But usually everything is coming from something else. And if it's good, then it's usually a mix of different things. Okay, and I'm getting completely into my own reaction to this question, to this subject. So I'm going to move on, because that was basically the end of that first panel, the spotlight on Charles Burns and Daniel Clowes. The next panel was the spotlight on Trina Robbins. Trina Robbins is a name that I have heard over the years. I was not familiar. I don't think I've read anything that she's written. There is one thing on my wish list that she wrote and I think drew. And I certainly, like I said, she has written a number of books about comic books, mainly about women creators, female creators. So this was an opportunity for me to learn more about her. She was interviewed by Heidi MacDonald of The Beat. I've seen Heidi on panels a number of times at SPX and at Heroes Con. I know certainly at both of those conventions before. And this was kind of, at first it seemed like it was going to be a Q&A, but it kind of devolved into just kind of a look back, a back and forth between, and not a negative back and forth, a positive back and forth between Heidi and Trina about women in comics and about her work and some of the women she's highlighted in the book she's written. So it was not as much of a Q&A. It started off as a Q&A, but it kind of devolved a little bit from there. It changed. It evolved, I guess. So it was a little harder for me to... So I only have a few questions here that were written down, but I'll kind of skim over some of the things that they discussed when they were talking about Trina Robbins' career. She was asked about, what she read as a child, about the influence of her mother on her. She told some stories about some of the things that she did. Well, she certainly talked about the comic books she would read back then and how there were comic books for girls back then, which is something that kind of got phased out after a point. I think it was around the early 70s, and I think there was a little bit about that back in when I was at Heroes Con at the Romance Comics panel that I went to. Trina talked about how she couldn't imagine drawing comics for a living, and it's something that she kind of evolved into. She didn't start there. By the mid-'60s, she was married. She was living in Los Angeles. She made clothes. That was one of her hobbies, I think. I think it was work, actually. I think it was work, but I don't recall exactly who it was for. I think it was some specialty sort of clothing. And by this point, she had given up her comic book. She told about how her mother had suggested that she should stop reading comic books when she got to high school. And so she gave away all her comic books, which she readily admitted would probably be worth thousands of dollars today if she still had them. But she rediscovered comic books through the underground press, through underground newspapers, in particular the East Village Other, which was a New York City paper that included quite a bit of comics. She eventually got divorced. She moved to New York City. one of the first things, well, I'm not sure if it was the first, I don't think it was the first thing she did, but one of the first comic books that I believe she produced was called It Ain't Me, Babe, and this came out in 1970, and it had a number of characters on the cover, only one of whom I didn't recognize. It was Olive Oil, Mary Marvel, Little Lulu, Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, and Wonder Woman, and then there was a cow on there, and I did not recognize the cow. I did not recognize the cow. There was a lot of talk about why there was so much objection to women working in comic books. In particular, this came not just from fellow creators, but also from the top management, from the editors-in-chief, from those sorts of people. Some of the other comics that Trina worked on, there was a long-running comic called Women's Comics, which ran for about 20 years. She talked about a comic book which never came out, but that she did a cover for, called Opium Traffic, which was influenced by the look of the cover, and they were showing slides throughout this, and the look of the cover was apparently inspired by the novel Dope by Sax Rohmer, which I believe I have, and I believe I've read. I read several, a couple decades ago at least. There was a little bit of talk about the Wonder Woman miniseries that Trina did back in 1985 called The Legend of Wonder Woman. And there was some question about who was the first. There was a little bit of discussion of who was the first woman to work on Wonder Woman, because apparently she was billed at that time as the first woman to write and draw Wonder Woman, but actually she was not the first woman to draw. I think she wrote and drew that story, but I'm not 100% certain. She was not the first woman to draw Wonder Woman, because Ramona Fradon had drawn Wonder Woman in the Super Friends comic book back in the late 70s. And there's also some suggestion that the wife of, well, one of the wives of the creator of Wonder Woman, and the creator's name is William Moulton Marston, and his wife Elizabeth, there's apparently some suggestion, possibly it's in the latest, there was a book that came out, I think, within the past year about him, that his wife Elizabeth worked with her husband to some degree in writing the comic book. So possibly she should be considered the first woman to work on Wonder Woman, but there's really, as I understand it, no documentation to necessarily to support that, I guess. About the same time that she was working on The Legend of Wonder Woman, or at least about the same time that came out, there was another miniseries, but this one at Marvel Comics, called Meet Misty, which was a 6-issue miniseries, which was kind of like some of the girls' comics from the 1950s and 60s, things like Patsy Walker. It only ran for 6 issues. Jim Shooter was still the editor-in-chief at that point. It was printed under the Star Comics imprint of Marvel Comics, which was an imprint that was aimed at younger kids. And apparently it was very popular with little girls, but it was not popular enough. Now, Trina Robbins had nothing but good things to say about Jim Shooter. She thought that possibly he had a soft spot in his heart for these comics because he had gotten... when he was early in his career, she said he was tasked with writing stories for girls' comics. So possibly that had something to do with it. There was talk about Eclipse Comics, that she had nice things to say about Eclipse Comics. She was always very much into paper dolls, and she liked to put paper dolls in the comic books, these paper dolls that girls could cut out, and I suppose boys too. I mean, it's not that boys can't cut them out, but I think they probably appealed more to girls, they appealed more to girls probably than they did to boys. Another series that she worked on, although a bit later, around the year 2000, was Go Girl, which was a 5-issue series from Image, and I believe that was really the last comic book that she worked on, or of any length, I think, that she worked on, and that only ran for 5 issues. I'm not sure if that was a mini-series or it only lasted 5 issues. Since then, and even before then, she's been working on books about women cartoonists. There's a book called A Century of Women Cartoonists. Some of the names of women cartoonists that she mentioned were Nell Brinkley, Rose O'Neill, and Lily Renee. And there's a book out recently about Lily Renee, who was an immigrant from Eastern Europe. I'm not sure exactly which country it was she came from, but she was Jewish, and so she fled the rise of Nazi Germany. I'm not sure if she was in Germany or somewhere else that was taken over by Germany, but she came to the United States and wound up working in comic books. And this is a name which I don't think I am familiar with at all. I've seen this book advertised a couple times, but I really don't know anything about it. But I'm kind of intrigued now, and I might give it a try. It is available on Kindle, so we'll see. We'll see. Some of the other books that she's written are Pretty in Ink. And she mentioned that she's got 4 books that are going to be coming out within the next year. I only managed to catch 3 of them. She says she's got a memoir coming out. She has a book coming out on Girl Commandos, which was I don't think they had their own comic book, because I looked into this a little bit, but they were a feature in one of the comic books of... Let me see if I still have this up or not. It was Speed Comics. Yes. And this is from like the early 1940s, and there has actually been some reprints of it. But most of the issues I'm seeing here are from like 1941, around there. And then there's a book that she wrote, well, a book not that she wrote, but that one of her grandfathers wrote, in Yiddish, and her grandfather had come from Belarus. He had written a book. It wasn't completely clear. I think the book was about the town, the shtetl, that he came from, the village that he came from. And she didn't have a copy of it, but her daughter found a copy of it in Yiddish, had it translated into English, and so now she's going to have it published. And I guess this is one of these books that's going to be coming out in the next year. And the English title that she's given to it is A Bunch of Jews and Other Stuff. And there was a 4th book but I missed what it was. Possibly it's in the recording, or maybe she just said there was 4, but then she never got around to naming all 4 of them. I'm not sure. There was a little bit of time for questions from the audience. There was a question about women in animation. There was a question about a computer game for girls that she had written, and it's called Hawaii High, Mystery of the Tiki, and it's from 1994. And according to her, it was the first computer game written specifically for girls. But the person who was asking the question didn't even remember the name of the game, and that's why they were asking about it. And when this person described the game enough, she remembered what he was talking about. There was a question about women cartoonists in other countries, because basically what Trina Robbins was talking about in this panel, and most of her writing is about American women cartoonists, and apparently there was an international organization at one point, and they did do a magazine of an international organization of women cartoonists. But I get the impression, I can't remember if she said exactly when this was, but that this was at least 20, maybe 30 years ago, that this organization and that this publication existed, and that she really hasn't kept up with that kind of stuff. And then finally she was asked whether there was any particular female writers or artists that she follows. And she couldn't think of any, but the one book that she mentioned was one which I actually mentioned, one that I'm interested in reading, which is Nimona by Noelle Stevenson, although she didn't remember the writer-artist's name. And that was it for this panel. A few more thoughts about the second day of the Small Press Expo. Really follow up on some of the things that I said earlier in this episode. First, the episode of the podcast in which I talked about the Ed Piskor panel at the 2014 Appleseed Comic-Con. I believe that was episode 21 of the podcast. The rest of my notes for this episode all have to do with the Trina Robbins panel. The book about the comic book artist Lily Renee by Trina Robbins is called Lily Renee, Escape Artist from Holocaust Survivor to Comic Book Pioneer. And a little bit about Lily Renee. She was born in Austria in 1925. She left Austria in 1938 and moved to England. And a year or two later, I believe, she moved to the United States. She's still alive. She now lives in New York. And I've discovered that I actually have a couple reprints of some comics she did. I don't think she's done any comic work recently, but one of the collections that I have, which is called Romance Without Tears, has a couple reprints of comics that she drew. When I Googled Trina Robbins and Kickstarter, just Trina Robbins Kickstarter, I found a couple things that I'd mentioned on this episode. The first was the Sax Romer's Dope. There was a Kickstarter. It ended successfully in August of 2016, about a month ago at the time I record this, and which she did the art for. So the podcast, the Kickstarter has ended, but maybe there's some way to get in on that if you're interested. And there certainly are, I believe, samples of her work there. She didn't write that, but I believe she did the drawings for it because, of course, the book was written by Sax Romer. I didn't dig too deep into what the Kickstarter was exactly, if it was just a graphic novel or if it was an illustrated version of the novel. But if you Google Trina Robbins Kickstarter, I believe that'll be the first thing that comes up. The second hit was another Kickstarter, and this one is still active as I record this. It doesn't end until November 1, 2016, and that's called A Minion Yidden. And it's a graphic novel by Trina Robbins, but it's based on her father's memoir. And it's her father. I think earlier I said it was her grandfather. That's what I thought she had said, but I guess I remembered incorrectly. It was her father's memoir of life as a child in Belarus, and also stories from his time as an adult in Brooklyn. And the final note is that on The Legend of Wonder Woman, the 1986 4-issue miniseries that Trina Robbins did, she co-wrote it with Kurt Busiek, but she did the art, both the covers and the interior art for that. And when I looked for it on mycomicshop.com, most of the issues were going, at least in very fine, they were going for about $6 or $7 a piece. It's only 4 issues, but still. I didn't check eBay to see if it could be had for less than that. I did find copies for less than that on Comic Collector Live. So that's it for the Small Press Expo for 2016. It's also basically it for convention season for me for this year or for now, with the exception of the panel recordings, which I will be releasing over the next at least 3, 4, 5 months, something like that. Like I said, I think I have 10 or a dozen of them that I have yet to release from the 4 conventions that I went to this year. My next convention, at least the next one that I have planned to go to, is 9 months away, and that's Heroes Con 2017. It's possible that I'll go to something else before then, but nothing in the immediate future. And if most likely it's just going to be some small show that they have here, a local show where you've got a bunch of dealers and no real programming or guests. As far as the podcasts go, up next it's going to be all comic books and cartoons for the next several months. I'm planning to get back to the Legion of Superheroes, the Great Darkness Saga, and finish that off. I believe there's just 2 more issues that I have to cover. Originally, my plan was to do 1 episode, but I think I've recorded enough on those 2 issues that I might break it into 2 episodes. And I might even continue with some coverage of Legion of Superheroes beyond that. I'm not sure. I'm undecided at this point whether I will or I won't. I'm certainly planning to read, but I'm not sure if I'm going to actually do episodes on those. I also have one more episode covering the first season of Teen Titans cartoon, and I have plans to go on and read some more of that. I also have plans to do a few more episodes on Silver Age Captain America and Iron Man, not on separate episodes on both. And you could follow what I've been reading, and because I read considerably more than I actually podcast about, but you can follow what I've been reading at davetalkscomicsnotes.blogspot.com. I write up notes for everything I read. Some of the notes are, sometimes I write a lot more, sometimes I write a lot less. I'm not sure that all the notes will make sense to everybody, but they can be found there. In addition, there's also a link at davetalkscomics.com to that notes blog. That's it for episode 125. My coverage of the 2016 Small Press Expo will continue sometime down the road when I post my recordings of the panels I talked about on this episode and the previous one. As I record this, I have about a dozen panel recordings from 2016 that I have not posted yet from HeroesCon, Pulp Fest, Baltimore Comic Con, and SPX, plus a few more from prior years. Dave Talks Comics can be found at davetalkscomics.com, as well as on iTunes, Stitcher, and a few other locations. If you have comments or questions, I can be reached at davetalkscomics@gmail.com, on Twitter @DaveTalksComics, or leave a comment on my website. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.
Why?